The dense jungle air of the Pacific Islands was thick with the smell of salt water and burning wood. The year was 1942, and the thunder of war had already begun to shake the world. For the men of the Imperial Japanese Army, the Pacific War was both an opportunity for glory and an all-consuming struggle for survival. On the other side of the battlefield, the Allied forces had begun to push back, slowly but steadily, against the expanding empire. It was a stormy night when a Japanese soldier, weary from months of relentless fighting, found himself among a group of captured prisoners. The enemy soldiers, young men from across the Pacific, led them away from the devastation, binding their hands tightly with rough ropes. As the prisoner marched, exhaustion weighing heavily on him, he noticed something that struck him as profoundly strange. At the camp, in a modest building that would soon serve as their new home, something unexpected awaited them. It was an object that had never touched their hands before, a bar of soap. They had seen it in propaganda films, sure, but this was real, a gift from their captors, not a symbol of surrender. In the same small room, razors and toothbrushes lay on a table, tools of hygiene, but also symbols of a life the soldiers had never associated with their enemies. How could the same people who fought them so ruthlessly offer such strange acts of kindness? What did this mean for their beliefs about the enemy? And what would it mean for their understanding of war and survival? It was a question that would haunt them throughout their captivity. The Pacific War was one of the most brutal conflicts in modern history, and for the Japanese soldiers who fought in it, the journey from fervent nationalism to eventual capture was often a harrowing one. In 1941, the Japanese Empire, under the leadership of Emperor Hirohito, sought to expand its influence across the Pacific, stretching its reach from the beaches of China to the islands of Southeast Asia. By 1942, the conflict had grown global, with the United States and its allies engaged in a desperate struggle to counter the rising power of Japan. The battlefront was vast, and so too was the diversity of experiences among the soldiers on either side of the conflict. For the Japanese soldiers, the brutal nature of combat and the propaganda they had been fed by their government shaped their view of the world. Japan, like many nations at war, painted a stark picture of the enemy. The Allies were portrayed not just as adversaries, but as inhuman, ruthless, and driven by values foreign to Japan's warrior spirit. The Japanese military culture, steeped in Bushido, the samurai code, taught soldiers to embrace death for the sake of the emperor and the empire. Surrender was seen as dishonorable. For the men who found themselves on the battlefield, the concept of being captured was almost unthinkable. The idea of being taken alive by the enemy was a notion they tried to push from their minds, for it carried with it the shame of failing their comrades, their families, and their nation. But the reality of war is rarely kind to idealism. In 1942, after Japan's defeat at the Battle of Midway, the balance of power began to shift. Slowly, American and Allied forces began to reclaim territory, and many Japanese soldiers found themselves on the losing side of a war they could no longer win. The journey into captivity for these soldiers was one filled with shock and disbelief. The men who had fought so fiercely for their emperor were now prisoners, facing an unknown and uncertain future. Many of them arrived at their new homes, prison camps in places like the Philippines, Guam, and other Pacific islands, without knowing what to expect. They had heard rumors of what awaited them in Allied hands, but the propaganda they had been fed in Japan painted a different picture of the enemy. In their minds, the Americans and the British were little more than savages, bent on destroying their culture and way of life. But what they found upon their arrival in the camps was not at all what they had been led to believe. They encountered men who did not treat them with open hostility, but rather with a strange form of care. There were no barbaric punishments awaiting them, no attempts to break their spirit through torture or deprivation. In fact, the camp they found themselves in seemed to offer comforts that were almost unimaginable in comparison to the severe conditions they had endured during their time as soldiers. It was here that the first contradiction would surface. In their first days as prisoners, the Japanese soldiers encountered something they could not have anticipated: cleanliness. At first, it seemed like a trivial matter, perhaps even a mere oddity. But it would soon become clear that something as simple as a bar of soap, a razor, and a toothbrush represented more than just hygiene. These were symbols of a completely different worldview, one that, in some ways, seemed almost foreign, but in other ways, human in a way they had never considered. The story of these men and their reactions to the strange kindness of their captors forms the crux of the narrative. How could their enemies, those they had been taught to despise, offer them something as simple and human as soap? Why would they be given razors to shave their faces, or toothbrushes to clean their teeth, when they had expected to be subjected to the harshest conditions possible? These were questions that challenged everything the prisoners had believed about their captors and forced them to confront the humanity of the very people they had been trained to view as monsters. The topic at hand, the shock and transformation of these Japanese POWs, highlights a key moment in history where the brutal realities of war collided with the unexpected compassion of the enemy. The story is not just about hygiene products or physical comfort. It is about the internal struggle that these men underwent as they grappled with the contradictions between the propaganda they had been raised on and the reality they faced as prisoners. It is a story of how the human spirit, when confronted with kindness in the most unlikely of places, can be transformed. For the Japanese soldiers who found themselves captured during the Pacific War, the shift from combatant to prisoner was often abrupt and disorienting. Their journey into captivity was the culmination of fierce battles and overwhelming loss, where survival often felt like an impossible task. The battles they fought were intense, and their chances of being captured seemed slim. Yet, as Allied forces pushed further into Japanese-held territories, the reality of surrender and capture became inevitable for many. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 marked a significant turning point in the war. For Japan, it was a humiliating defeat that shattered their belief in the invincibility of their forces. The losses suffered by the Imperial Navy, both in ships and in aircraft, were staggering. It was the first major defeat for Japan and set the stage for a series of setbacks that would eventually force the Japanese military to retreat from much of the Pacific. As Japanese forces were driven back, more soldiers found themselves trapped, surrounded by an enemy they had long been taught to despise. The men who were captured had often been part of elite units, proud warriors of the Imperial Army who had fought fiercely for their country. Many of them had been conditioned to believe that the war was not just a military campaign, but a moral crusade, an extension of Japan's honor and destiny. Their mindset had been shaped by the fervent nationalistic propaganda that permeated every aspect of their lives, from their training to the media they consumed. Propaganda painted the Allied soldiers, especially the Americans and the British, as cruel, unfeeling, and determined to destroy Japan and its way of life. The Allies, they were told, were driven by a desire for conquest and racial superiority. These were not men of honor, but of brutality. Such depictions served to bolster the morale of soldiers on the front lines, encouraging them to fight harder, longer, and to never surrender. To fall into captivity was, in the eyes of many Japanese soldiers, a dishonorable fate, and something they were trained to avoid at all costs. The Japanese military was rigid in its belief that a soldier's duty was to fight to the death. Surrender was seen as a betrayal of the emperor and the nation. Soldiers who surrendered were often seen as weak or cowardly, their bravery questioned. To be captured was to lose face, not only for oneself, but for one's family and comrades. In this culture, survival in captivity was not a concept they could easily embrace. They expected the worst: mistreatment, punishment, starvation, or even execution. As the war moved into its later stages, and the Allies gained more territory, the Japanese soldiers who were captured found themselves facing a new, unsettling reality. The expectations they had carried with them into captivity, shaped by years of military training and nationalistic propaganda, began to crumble as they encountered their captors. Upon their arrival at POW camps, many of these soldiers were struck by the stark difference between what they had expected and the reality they faced. They had anticipated cruelty, deprivation, and abuse. Instead, they were met with a strange, unfamiliar order. Food, though not abundant, was given regularly. Basic medical care was provided. The environment was far less hostile than they had imagined. Even the air in the camps, though thick with humidity, seemed far more tolerable than the heat of the battlefield. But it was the small things that truly unsettled them. The prisoners were given clean clothing and soap to wash with. They were handed razors to shave and toothbrushes to clean their teeth. These were simple comforts that, in their minds, should have been denied to them. In fact, they had been taught to believe that their captors, whom they considered their enemies, would show them no mercy, no compassion. And yet, here they were, receiving items that were not just practical, but also deeply human. For a people raised on a culture of honor, where cleanliness and grooming were seen as markers of discipline and self-respect, these simple tools of hygiene began to challenge everything they had been taught about the enemy. For the first time, the prisoners began to ask themselves, was this kindness a sign of weakness on the part of the Allies? Or was it something more? Were these captors, who had been portrayed as barbarians, actually offering them something unexpected? A glimpse of humanity in the midst of war? It wasn't just the items they were given that caused confusion. The very act of being treated as something more than mere prisoners of war, the act of being treated with a semblance of dignity, was something that shattered their preconceived notions. Their minds began to wrestle with this dissonance. They had been raised to view surrender and capture as disgraceful, but they were now being shown that not all enemies operated by the same rules. The simple acts of hygiene were a catalyst, forcing them to confront the deep contradictions between their worldview and the reality in which they now found themselves. As the early days in the camp passed, the prisoners could not escape the cognitive dissonance. They had expected to be treated as less than human, just as the propaganda had told them their captors treated prisoners. Instead, they were treated with an unexpected measure of respect. The soldiers' resolve was beginning to weaken, their beliefs questioned by their new reality. What they had been taught to fear, the cruelty of the enemy, was not present. And as they adjusted to their new surroundings, they were forced to reconsider their assumptions about honor, survival, and the very nature of their war. The impact of these early experiences in captivity was profound. The Japanese soldiers, initially filled with anger and resentment, were beginning to question the teachings that had guided them throughout their lives. Their perceptions of the enemy were beginning to shift, but this was only the beginning. The true transformation was yet to come. For many of the Japanese POWs, their first days in captivity were filled with profound shock and disbelief. They had been conditioned by years of propaganda to see their captors as cold, ruthless, and devoid of humanity. Yet, as they settled into their new surroundings, they quickly realized that the reality of war, at least in this corner of the Pacific, was vastly different from what they had expected. The first surprise came in the form of food. In the prisoner camps, while the meals were far from luxurious, they were certainly more plentiful than the soldiers had anticipated. The Japanese soldiers, accustomed to fighting in some of the harshest conditions, had often gone days without eating, surviving on scant rations or foraging in the wild. They had assumed that, upon capture, they would be subjected to extreme hunger, their basic needs neglected by their captors. But instead, they found that the food provided to them, though simple, was consistent. Rice, vegetables, and sometimes meat, far more than they had expected, even if it was not always to their liking. For many, the mere act of having enough to eat was enough to elicit a sense of disbelief. One prisoner, A young lieutenant named Sato wrote in a letter to his family, "I had heard that our captors would starve us, treat us like animals, but here we are fed twice a day. The food is not much, but it is more than we have seen in months. The rice is soft, and there is always something to drink." For Sato and others, the reality of being a prisoner was beginning to challenge everything they had been taught. The shame they had expected to feel in captivity was being replaced by a strange gratitude. But it wasn't just the food that shocked them. It was also the conditions of their quarters. The barracks were simple but functional. Unlike the overcrowded, filthy prisons they had heard about in their own country's propaganda, the Allied camps were clean and orderly. The wooden bunks were often shared, but they were at least free from the pests and vermin that had plagued the Japanese camps back home. For many of the prisoners, the lack of disease and the cleanliness of the camp were a jarring contrast to what they had been told about their captors' disregard for life. One prisoner recalled, "I thought we would be treated like animals, thrown into dark, unsanitary cells, but instead we are given blankets, clean clothing, and even soap. It was the soap that caused the greatest confusion. In their own country, the use of soap was considered an essential part of a soldier's daily routine, a symbol of discipline and pride. To receive soap from the enemy felt not only strange, but almost humiliating. To use soap in the presence of an enemy soldier was to acknowledge their superiority in a way that seemed impossible. Yet, they used it out of necessity, out of the simple human desire to stay clean. And in doing so, they began to wrestle with the complexity of their situation. Sato, who had been one of the most vocal about his hatred of the Allied forces, began to feel the weight of his own contradictions. "We are given razors to shave, toothbrushes to clean our teeth, and soap to wash ourselves," he wrote to his family. What kind of enemy does this? What kind of people care for prisoners this way? It was a question that many of the prisoners were beginning to ask themselves, even if they were unwilling to voice it aloud. Some prisoners, unable to reconcile their own expectations with the reality they faced, began to question their beliefs outright. Corporal Takahashi, who had been one of the staunchest supporters of Japan's war effort, wrote in his diary, "I thought I would die before I ever surrendered. I thought I would be tortured, or at the very least starved. But here we are treated as men, not beasts. I cannot understand it." The emotional dissonance of being treated with respect by those they had been taught to fear and despise left many of the prisoners deeply unsettled. The first cracks began to form in the armor of their ideological training. Yet the contradictions did not end with food and hygiene. As the days passed, the prisoners began to encounter even more unexpected elements in the camp. Simple pleasures that further challenged their views. They were given time to write letters to their families, an opportunity that was both rare and precious. In many ways, it felt like an acknowledgement of their humanity, something that went against the expectations they had harbored about the enemy. Their captors, it seemed, were allowing them to maintain a connection to the outside world, to the families they had fought so hard to protect. Despite the occasional bitterness they felt, many prisoners began to write more frequently. Some were writing to reassure their families, while others, like Takahashi, used the opportunity to process their emotional turmoil. "We are treated with kindness, though we are enemies," he wrote in one letter. "I do not know how to feel. My country tells me that they are beasts, but these men offer us peace." It was clear that for some, the internal struggle was beginning. The idea of surrender, once anathema to their beliefs, was starting to lose its rigid boundaries. Their pride, so long a central part of their identity, began to waver. But not all prisoners reacted the same way. Some, like Lieutenant Sato, clung desperately to their old beliefs, refusing to accept that their captors might have any semblance of decency. They continued to see their time in captivity as a shameful experience, one that could only be endured, not embraced. For them, using soap or shaving with a razor was a painful reminder of their defeat. an act of subjugation that seemed too much to bear. Still, the overall sense of confusion among the prisoners grew. The initial shock of receiving basic comforts was compounded by the growing realization that their captors were not the monsters they had been led to believe. How could this be? Was it possible that the enemy, the one they had been taught to hate, was not so different from them after all? As the days wore on, their minds began to spiral into deeper questions. Could kindness in the midst of war truly exist? And if it did, what did that mean for their understanding of loyalty, honor, and duty? As the weeks passed, the Japanese POWs, still reeling from the shock of being treated with an unexpected degree of humanity, continued to experience a cascade of contradictions. With each passing day, their perceptions of the enemy, whom they had been raised to view as cruel and unfeeling, shifted further from the black and white images painted by wartime propaganda. The food, the soap, the razors, these were only the beginning. What followed were encounters and discoveries that deeply unsettled the Yutihiri soldiers' beliefs and challenged their worldview in ways they had never anticipated. One of the most striking contradictions came in the form of entertainment. In the midst of the harshness of war, their captors offered something that seemed unimaginable: music and games. The prisoners, initially skeptical, were first introduced to the concept through communal activities. The Allied forces, despite being engaged in a brutal global conflict, would organize camp-wide events that featured songs, games, and even theatrical performances. It wasn't grand by any measure, but it was a stark contrast to the cold, militaristic structure they had been taught to expect from their enemies. For many of the Japanese soldiers, this entertainment was not just surprising, it was bewildering. They had been conditioned to view the Allies as a ruthless, faceless enemy, driven only by the desire to dominate. Yet, here they were, participating in sing-alongs and listening to music they had never expected to hear in a POW camp. One of the prisoners, Private Mori, a quiet man who had remained largely detached from the others, found himself, to his own surprise, humming along to a melody that was played on a radio one evening. He recalled in his diary, "At first I refused to listen, but slowly the music grew on me. How can they, the enemy, bring such joy to us? I thought they only knew how to make us suffer." It was a moment of revelation for Mori, a reminder that the humanity of the enemy was not confined to the battlefield. Music, like food and cleanliness, was a tool for connection, not oppression. Similarly, the prisoners began to notice that the guards, those very men who had once been their oppressors, were also showing unexpected kindness. While the guards were undoubtedly there to maintain order and prevent any uprisings, they did not treat the prisoners with the hatred or cruelty that many had expected. In fact, some guards would offer small gestures of goodwill, lending a listening ear, offering an extra blanket when the nights grew cold, or simply sharing a moment of conversation. This interaction was so far removed from the brutal image of the enemy that it created further internal conflict among the prisoners. One soldier, Sergeant Yamamoto, recalled a moment that would haunt him for years to come. As he struggled to adjust to the harsh realities of captivity, a guard noticed his frustration and silently placed an extra blanket at the foot of his bed one night. Yamamoto, stunned, looked up and met the guard's eyes. "You are a prisoner, not an animal," the guard had said, before walking away without another word. The gesture, though small, had a profound effect on Yamamoto. It was a moment that forced him to question everything he had ever believed about the enemy. How could this man, a soldier like myself, show kindness in such a place? Yamamoto later wrote, "The act of human decency shattered his perception of the guards as faceless monsters." As these moments accumulated, the emotional contradictions became impossible to ignore. Many of the prisoners began to speak in hushed tones about what they were experiencing, sharing their confusion with one another. The realization that their captors, the very people they had been taught to fear, were capable of acts of kindness, was too much to reconcile with the hatred they had carried into captivity. This cognitive dissonance grew stronger as the prisoners began to feel a strange sense of guilt. Could they, in good conscience, continue to hate these men who were treating them with dignity and respect? The change in perspective was not universal, however. For some soldiers, especially those who had been the most fervently loyal to Japan's wartime ideals, the contradictions were too much to bear. Lieutenant Sato, who had remained resolute in his belief that the Allies were barbarians, began to grow resentful of what he saw as weak behavior from his fellow prisoners. "I will never forgive myself for being captured, for losing face in front of my comrades," he wrote in his journal. He could not accept the kindness he was receiving. To him, every meal, every bar of soap, every extra blanket was a constant reminder of his failure. He felt increasingly isolated, unable to share the emotional transformation that many of his comrades were undergoing. Yet, even in his resistance, Sato could not escape the reality unfolding around him. He observed the change in the men who had begun to accept their new reality, who were starting to question the very foundations of the beliefs they had brought with them into captivity, and it troubled him. As much as he tried to cling to his old ways, he could not help but notice the cracks in his own thinking. He began to wonder, even if only in fleeting moments, if his hatred of the enemy had been misplaced. The seeds of inner conflict were planted in the hearts of many Japanese soldiers during this period. For some, the path to transformation was slow and painful. For others, it was an irreversible shift. But regardless of the pace, the underlying tension between their old beliefs and the reality they were now experiencing was undeniable. It wasn't just the small comforts or acts of kindness that changed them. It was the way those moments prompted them to reassess everything they thought they knew about the enemy. The emotional turmoil was difficult to articulate, even in letters home. Many prisoners wrote of their confusion and struggle, but they could not fully explain the depth of their inner conflict. How could they? How could they admit that the people they had been taught to hate were offering them a better life than they had ever known in battle? The realization that their captors were not, as they had imagined, an enemy to be feared, hated, and destroyed, was something that most of the prisoners had to work through privately. The war had been fought on the battlefields, but it was now being fought in their hearts and minds. And as the days wore on, their transformation from warriors steeped in national pride to men struggling with the contradictions of war continued to unfold. As the weeks turned into months, the tension in the Japanese POW camps steadily built to a breaking point. The contradictions that had shaken the prisoners' beliefs earlier had now evolved into a profound internal struggle. The environment, initially seen as a hostile and uncomfortable place, had transformed into one where the prisoners began to experience a strange sense of security and even comfort, luxuries they had not anticipated. Yet, beneath this, there was still a deep undercurrent of resentment, guilt, and confusion. For some men, the mental strain of reconciling their past beliefs with the reality they were experiencing was too much to bear. It was in these months that the most significant emotional turning points occurred. The pivotal moment for many came during a larger camp-wide event that brought the prisoners and their captors face to face in a way that had never occurred before. It was an event that would force the prisoners to confront their perceptions of their captors in the most direct manner possible. The event in question was a meeting between the prisoners and the camp leaders. The Allied forces had decided to give the Japanese soldiers a chance to voice their concerns. It was a rare opportunity for prisoners to speak directly with the officers in charge and to express their feelings and frustrations. For many of the prisoners, this felt like a moment of reckoning, an opportunity to express their anger, their shame, and their confusion. The meeting was structured in such a way that prisoners could speak in a controlled environment, presenting their grievances one by one. What occurred, however, was not what anyone had expected. Instead of an outpouring of resentment and hatred towards their captors, as many of the prisoners had initially imagined, The soldiers began to open up about the internal conflicts they had been wrestling with since their arrival. They spoke not just about the food or the conditions, but about their changing perceptions of the enemy. They confessed that they had begun to question everything they had been taught. Some admitted that they could no longer view the Allies as the monsters they had been led to believe. Others expressed their guilt, wondering aloud why they had been treated with such dignity and respect. It was a stark departure from the rigid loyalty and unyielding hatred that had been instilled in them back in Japan. Lieutenant Sato, still reluctant to admit the full extent of his transformation, stood at the back of the room, watching the others speak. As much as he wanted to hold on to his belief in the absolute superiority of Japan and its cause, the conversations that filled the room caused him to feel a deep sense of unease. He could no longer ignore the uncomfortable truth that his fellow soldiers were beginning to accept. The kindness of their captors, those very men who had been branded as subhuman, had changed the nature of their captivity. They were not just surviving, they were adapting, growing, and, in some cases, beginning to form a bond with their captors. It was this realization, shared by many of the prisoners, that marked the climax of their emotional journey. The transformation was not just about accepting food or hygiene. Those were simple, external comforts. What had truly changed was their understanding of war, of humanity, and of their own place in the world. They had been forced to confront the idea that war was not a black and white battle between good and evil, as they had been taught. Instead, they had learned that the enemy was not so different from them, and that human decency could survive even in the harshest of conditions. For Lieutenant Sato, the turning point came when he was asked, during the meeting, how he viewed the treatment of prisoners. Reluctantly, he stood up and spoke, his voice shaky. "I thought the enemy was nothing like us," he said. "I thought they would be cruel. But they are not. They have shown us kindness when I thought we would only suffer. I don't know what to believe anymore." The moment was profound, not just for Sato, but for all the men in the room. They could see the struggle within him, the same struggle that many of them had experienced themselves. What followed was an unspoken understanding that hung in the air. The prisoners had come to realize that the enemy they had feared was not simply a symbol of their own destruction, but a reflection of the complexities of human nature. The captors, too, were bound by the same emotions, driven by their own sense of duty, honor, and survival. In that moment, the notion of enemy began to collapse, and the line between the two sides, once so rigid, began to blur. The transformation was not immediate, nor was it easy. It was an ongoing process of self-reflection and confrontation with deeply ingrained beliefs. But for those who had been able to let go of their former animosity, the experience was nothing short of liberating. They began to understand that their survival in captivity was not simply about endurance, but about coming to terms with the complexity of the world around them. They had been prisoners, yes, but they were also human beings, capable of change, capable of growth. For those like Lieutenant Sato, the shift was less dramatic, but no less important. Though he could not fully embrace the idea that the Allies were as human as he was, he had taken the first step toward reconciling his past with his present. And that, for him, was the most profound transformation of all. As time passed, the emotional intensity of their internal battles began to ebb, replaced by a more peaceful acceptance. The soldiers began to see their captors not as faceless enemies, but as people. People who had given them food, shelter, and even kindness. They began to accept that not everything in war could be explained by propaganda, and that sometimes the human side of the conflict was the most unexpected of all. The days of captivity stretched on, and slowly but surely, the Japanese prisoners of war came to terms with the transformations they had undergone. When they were finally liberated, the men returned to Japan, physically changed, but, more importantly, emotionally and psychologically reshaped by their experiences. The war was not over for them just because they were free. The internal struggle they had faced in the camps would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Many would go on to speak about their time as POWs with a sense of quiet humility, understanding that their view of the world had been irrevocably altered by their treatment at the hands of their captors. For some, the shock of encountering kindness in the midst of war became a lasting lesson in humanity. The simple acts of receiving soap, razors, toothbrushes, and food were small but profound experiences that pushed them to question their deeply held beliefs about the enemy. They had been taught to see their captors as less than human, but in the end, it was their captors who showed them what true humanity looked like in the most unexpected of places. The experience of these Japanese POWs speaks to the broader lessons of war and conflict, that the line between us and them is not as rigid as we may be led to believe, and that in the most dire of circumstances, small acts of kindness can have a profound impact. In a world where division and animosity seem so easily cultivated, the story of these men reminds us that even in the darkest moments, humanity can still prevail. And as the years go by, we are left with one enduring question. How often do we allow ourselves to see the humanity in others, even when history and propaganda tell us to do otherwise?